Transitions are crucial moments of pupil learning, and as such, they need planning just as much as the rest of the lesson. I've come today to Pershore High School in Worcestershire to see how effective transition can enhance pupil learning. A lesson is a story, and like any narrative, to make sense of it, we have to understand not only the events, but the connections between them. Discovery is great, but explorers need guides as well as maps.
Right, good morning everybody. Today we're going to be looking at a poem ready for your literature exam, which is next year. On your desk you can see that you've got some brown envelopes. Can you open the envelopes please? And inside you should have, I think it's about 8 or 10 pictures. I'd like you as a group to have a look at those pictures please, and to make some observations about how those pictures could represent a relationship.
Your starter really was effective because it set an agenda of a connection between images and emotions. But also it was progressive because it started away from the poem and in areas where they could kind of make sense of those connections. It's harder to make some of those connections that are in the poem cold. You needed warming up towards that idea.
And I find that this idea of the task being progressive, that's something that even though I've been teaching for sort of 8 years now, that's something that I've only really felt comfortable with in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, that I can actually plot a way through a lesson and I can see how it's going to develop. So I think that's something that, you know, does take time to develop. To give you an example, first of all, you've got a sofa. What could a sofa represent a relationship? What is a sofa? What does it feel like, Patch?
It could be like a couple, it's like 2 seats and like you both fit snug on the couch. So.
Excellent.
When I look at your plan, there isn't much writing there about how you're going to speak to them. And this is true of a lot of lesson plans, really. Even the blank forms that you see are big spaces where pupil activity is going to be written, but very little space about what happens in between. What I'm interested in today, in particular, is those parts of the lesson that happen in between those big activities. You know, you might call them the transition moments, and they involve task setting, of course, but they involve quite a lot of other things too.
What would you have to use the first aid kit for in a relationship?
Healing.
Do you think? Healing. So if there's
fixing things.
Yeah, excellent. You had an excellent point, didn't you, about the flowers?
I also saw the flower as like a family tree, and like it blossom new like buds and flowers out, and that's what a family tree like when you have a baby. It'll just keep going, and then it like won't ever die if you keep giving it water. So if you keep bringing new life to something, it'll carry on going just like the flower would if you kept giving it water.
Now, hopefully, you've kind of seen where we're going with this lesson. Any ideas what sort of we're going to be focusing on, Claudia?
Relationships?
Yeah, relationships, okay? We're going to be looking at a poem that focuses on relationships. I want you to bear all of those ideas in mind before, you know, to take those with you when we look at the poem, right? Because some of those points that you've made, hopefully, will link in quite nicely with the poem. Now, I've got one more slide which has some more key images. Now, these are images from the poem, and I just want you to just spend 5 minutes this time, and again, I'll just ask quickly for hands up. Just would like you to think about how these images could work with a poem about relationships.
I would argue it's the connection between activity A and activity B where the learning really lives in the lesson, you know. So that instead of seeing a lesson as something that goes along like that and then dips and then carries on, and the dip is the gap between the lessons, sometimes the teacher seems to live in that dip. And we don't want the teacher in the dip. We want her on a little peak. So, you know, I'm quite interested in defining what really happens in those moments.
I think that's really difficult. I suppose you don't always do that, and I suppose that sometimes you might think, you know, it's quite explicit to us where the links are.
I think that's absolutely the point. We've got our activities, we've got them in rank order, and we know what the connection is. We know what the story of the lesson is. You can do that, and then you'll be able to do this.
I'm going to read the poem to you, And I want you to bear these images in mind and the points that you've made. And I also want you to try and guess what scenario the poet is describing, what's actually happening within the poem. I have to make a conscious effort to link the task. So I have to say to them, you know, think back to the starter, you know, how does that link in? And absolutely. I have to do that. And if I don't do it, if I forget to do it, because I just sort of carry on in my lesson, that's when they perhaps struggle, and that's when they can't see the relevance of how it all fits together.
I think that's a fair comment. I mean, it didn't seem to happen today.
No.
It worked today, and you were very consciously and explicitly aware of that need to make those connections. Yeah. And you did it verbally.
Did you all find looking at those pictures before and talking about it useful before we moved into the poem? Because did you all recognise the images on there within the poem? Yeah, you all found them. Excellent. Any suggestions as to what is literally going on, Claudia?
I saw like the child looking up to the mother, like centimetres into metres, the way he says about the greater lengths, and like because the mother's older. So the child looking up to the mother. That's
a really interesting point. Do you know what, Claudia? I've been teaching this poem for about 8 or 9 years now, and nobody's ever made that point. That's excellent.
Can you think of ways in which you might have been able to do it that weren't simply reminders, verbal reminders?
I suppose maybe asking them to think about how the activities link together.
Yes. I think asking them to chart the story of the lesson.
Yeah.
What do you think the connection is between what we're doing now and what we did earlier is a very interesting evaluative question. It takes you into what you might call meta-learning, where you're actually discussing the lesson. You know, you're actually discussing the learning, not just the poem. And it also helps you to evaluate whether they're making those connections. In simple terms, a simple whiteboard in the corner of the room or a flip chart or some sort of electronic display where you're recording those points from activity A and leaving them there. This is a very basic point. So that it's still there looking at them, and they're looking at it in activity B. They're being physically reminded of activity A. You know.
That's a good idea. I've not done anything like that, so.
Well, I think, you know, then you've got a kind of resource bank of reminders to help them into the next activity.
Person who is moving out, like after living with his mum and stuff, and he's like, mum's came round to help measure up all the stuff, and
No, that's bang on. You're absolutely right. Logan's got it down to a T. The child is moving out of home and he's asked his mother to come. Well, we assume it's him. We assume this is autobiographical. We assume this is Simon Armitage speaking. So he's asked his mother to come and help him to measure up.
The lesson is a wall and the activities are bricks, and the transitions are the mortar.
Yeah.
You know, and the wall falls down without the mortar. So I do think they matter very much, although they're often underplanned.
And they're also at the time, aren't they, where you can perhaps lose the class as well.
Yeah.
In the transitions, that's when they can perhaps lose focus and go off.
Yeah, I think it's where you can pull them back together, and it's where you can talk to them, and that's why I would say to trainee teachers, it's fine to script a little bit what you're going to say there. And very often the trainee teacher or the experienced teacher will say, but I want it to come from them. Yeah. I don't want to dominate the room. I want to be a facilitator of learning. And I absolutely accept that, and I think that's an absolutely right instinct. But actually, if you plan your own language a little bit in those transitions, so you've got a rule that I'm going to explain any new idea or any new task in 3 different ways, and you have that as a kind of background planning rule. If you do that, it's likely, I would say, that you're going to talk less in those transition periods, not more. You're not actually planning great long speeches. No. You are planning a slightly more efficient way of explaining things.
Have you picked up on what technique Armitage has used? What do we call these images? And then can you say it is imagery, but there's one particular poetic device in specifically.
Metaphors and.
No.
Yeah, no, you're right, Patch. Metaphors, aren't they?
Yeah.
But the whole situation, the whole scenario is what? It's got a metaphor in it, but there's a word before it.
What's it start with?
E.
Extreme metaphor.
What do you say, Charlie?
Extreme metaphor?
Extreme, no, it's not quite an extreme metaphor. It's an extended metaphor.
Transition is a crucial time of evaluation. A lot of teachers will evaluate in plenaries at the end. And of course, all teachers, if they're good teachers, are evaluating all the time, and you are evaluating all the time through that lesson. You're constantly on evaluative alert as to whether they're understanding what's happening. But I also think we need to evaluate quite formally, really, by one activity or another at the end of each lesson stage. So that's part of what happens in a transition. And in doing that, you're probably consolidating and maybe actually defining the learning. It may be that first transition after the starter in any lesson is where you're actually defining the learning.
That's the key one.
Yeah, where you're actually pulling from that initial activity certain ideas that we can now deploy into the rest of the lesson.
If you look at the start of each stanza, the start of the verse, then it's all about person. The first one's mother, second one's you, third one's I. So it's about both of them.
Brilliant, that's an A-star answer. Did you all hear that, what Pat's just said about the 3 verses? First verse begins with mother, second verse begins with you, and the third verse begins with I. Okay? So by the end of the poem, the poet has made his decision that he has to be on his own. So it begins with it being about his mother and about you, but by the end of the poem, he's I, and he's strong about that.
Part of that defining function of the transition might have been to say, almost after the first activity, we can look at these images and as metaphors or similes describing.
Because that's what I had in my head, but obviously that's not what I said
you
to
did
them.
Come to
Yeah,
it.
I
You
did
absolutely
come,
came to
but
it.
that is exactly why I chose the household objects, because I thought the metaphors in the poem.
Well,
so,
you did come to it. You did come to it. I think I'm just interested in the idea that if you are planning the transitions as carefully as you're planning the activities, you might be slightly rounder and richer in dealing with those key learning moments and those key defining moments. Having said that, what you actually did then do, and it was about the sofa, you modelled it. The sofa was your first example, and you actually talked them through what you meant. So the criticism, if it was a criticism that I've just made, doesn't really stand, because although you didn't really define what you meant by represent, you did model it. And it's silly, really. There aren't really rules, but let's think in terms of rules for task setting. And one of my rules would be always model, always take the first one and model it. I think an example is worth 1,000 explanations.
Before we go on to the plenary, there's just a couple of questions that I'd like you to jot down the answers to before we move on to the last bit. And the first question is, what techniques does Armitage use to describe the relationship with his mother? And I'd like you to list all the techniques. Now, you picked up on the metaphors. I had a little chat with Sam about some other techniques which were within the poem. Sam was looking at anchor kite, and there's another technique that's used there. There's more than just metaphors. And then the second question is, what do you learn about the poet's feelings? Are there any questions about that? No? Just 2 or 3 minutes to do that, okay?
I have seen the classrooms of not just trainee, but mainly trainee teachers transformed in terms of behaviour, in terms of learning, in all sorts of ways, when I have persuaded them to do QDO every time they set a task, as a rule. So QDO and model, the first one, are my rules for task setting. So Q stands for, are there any questions? Although, as you know, that's not a great question to ask children, because they never answer that question truthfully. They'll very often say they understand when they don't, and then when you set them off on the task, they start putting their hands up and saying, do you mean? The best way I've found is to ask children in pairs to discuss the task and see if they understand it, and that takes 30 seconds. D, you were really strong on. D stands for deadline, and it means simply telling them how long they've got. It might seem a bit banal, again, But saying you've got 3 weeks to do this, or you've got 8 minutes to do this, is very informative to pupils, because it doesn't just tell them how long they've got. It actually tells them a lot about the depth, breadth, detail that you're expecting them to go into. Finally, O is outcome, and by this I don't mean learning objective or intended learning outcome. I mean what's going to happen next. So you've got 20 minutes to do this, and in 20 minutes we're going to have a feedback, or you're going to share it with a friend, or you're going to write a poem. But you'll have to have done this other thing first. With QDO, I find that teachers almost always do Q. They sometimes do Q and D. They rarely do all three, and O is the one they do least.
It also means that, like, if he's got any problems, then he can go home.
Yeah.
And it's like a safe place for him.
Yeah. Excellent, well done. It kind of finishes up the whole poem, doesn't it? You know, he doesn't know how it's gonna end. He might fail. You know, he's taking this big risk. But as Jack said, and as Logan said, with the mother being the constant, he can always go home at the end. Kind of brings it all back. That's excellent work, folks. Well done.
It's been fascinating to talk today about transitions in lessons. In my work, I see lots of lessons and read lots of lesson plans, and it's very common for a lot of energy to have been devoted to creating pupil activities and pupil resources. But it's also quite common for much less attention to have been paid to those key moments of transition between the activities. And perhaps it's in those transitional moments, with their task setting, consolidation, evaluation, explanation, definition, that the learning really lives.